Hey everyone, it's Andy Kushner with the Wedding Biz, and today's interview release is a particularly fun one for me because our special guest who I'm about to introduce is based in France and was in Paris when I interviewed him. And when I was 23, I took my first solo trip out of the country, and for some reason, Paris really called out to me. And I can't even begin to explain the excitement I felt going there by myself at that age. And I stayed with a friend of a friend right in the city. I purchased one of those all-you-can-use metro passes and explored practically every inch of that city. I mean, I was out every single day from mid-morning until late at night, and that was for 10 days straight. And it was such a vibrant city and so beautiful and just knocked me out in so many ways, not just walking around and seeing the environment, which was amazing, but also the various museums and the restaurants. And that trip really set the tone for all of the subsequent travel that I've done throughout my life. And I can't recommend enough how invigorating it is to get away to a completely different location from where you live, especially for creatives such as ourselves. So first, if you missed last week, I interviewed planner designer Tyler Spire, who is also an expert with social media, which is what we focused on. And today's interview is a revisit of my first conversation with the amazing photographer Greg Finck. Based in France, Greg worked 10 years as a marketing executive for Proctor and Gamble in Paris and started shooting weddings a little over 14 years ago and professionally 9 years ago, and is now doing major weddings, with part of his business being in fashion. He also quickly learned how to most effectively utilize social media as a marketing tool and currently has over 100,000 Instagram followers. Greg gives masterclasses, workshops, and has spoken at Engage about authentic branding. Enjoy this conversation with Greg Finck. Greg, it is such a pleasure to have you on the show and also to be interviewing you with you being in Paris. I love it. It's wonderful.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very excited.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you too. I think you have such an interesting background from what I can tell. You know, it's interesting. When I was looking at your website, I saw a quote by Audrey Hepburn that you have, which is, "Elegance is the only beauty that never fades." Mm-hmm. Elegance is the only beauty that never fades. I love that. Why did you want to put that on your site? What does that mean for you?
I just love that because I think it summarized the approach I try to have in my photography. I just like the timeless elegance of film because I shoot film and we will probably talk more about that. But I mean, wedding photography can be difficult in the sense where you don't want your photo to be outdated when people will look at them in years or decades. So I really try to bring my aesthetic and I try to bring elegance in my work so that when people will look at these photos in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, they will still look timeless and elegant.
You know, it's so interesting. You're making me think. I had interviewed this sculptor for another show that I have, Extraordinary, Ordinary People, and he sculpts in bronze. And I asked him why bronze, and he said, well, in 10,000 years, people can still look at it, and touch it. And it was just such an interesting way to think about it. So I like what you're saying, that even decades later, you want people to be able to enjoy it and see the beauty. Well, when did this start for you? I mean, from what I understand, your father taught you photography in a family darkroom. Was he a professional photographer? What was that all about?
So it was definitely not professional, but he was very passionate about photography. So we had a darkroom and an enlarger and all of the chemistry at home. Uh-huh. So basically, he gave me a camera when I was something like 12 or 13, as far as I can remember. And most of the childhood memories that I have is me processing my prints and my negs in the dark rooms. And I remember the smell of it. So I basically taught photography. I basically learned photography, with my dad as a kid. And this has always been part of my life.
Was it black and white that you were doing, or were you starting right in color?
Mostly black and white. I don't know how to process color neg, but I definitely knows how to do a black and white negatives. So I shot mostly in black and white, and I think it shaped my eye because the fact of not having to consider the colors helps you to focus on the subject.
Oh.
So I've always been a portrait photographer. I remember taking photos of my parents, taking photos of my friends. I was inviting lots of girls from school at home to make portraits.
That's a good way to meet girls, isn't
it? Exactly. So I've always been a portrait photographer, let's say, and some of my memories as a kid, I remember like looking at my parents' wedding albums, my grandparents' wedding albums, and I was like, wow, isn't it funny that like years after, decades after, the first thing you're going to do when you show up to your parents' home or your grandparents' home is that you're going to open the wedding album. So I thought this was kind of magical, and I guess this is how it all started.
That's really interesting. It's funny. I was 13 and I created a dark room in my parents' house in the utility room where the washer dryer was, and did black and white. And I know when you talk about the smells, developer and fixer, I remember the chemicals and just the power at that age as a teenager to be able to capture images. I just thought it was magical, like the way you're talking about. Well, what did you do? It's interesting. From what I understand, you ended up going into business school in France, and then getting an MBA, Master's of Business Administration. Did you ever think before you went to school of being a photographer, or was that strictly a hobby in your mind at that time?
It was strictly a hobby, and I didn't see it otherwise. So basically, my parents told me when I was 20, okay, it's fun to have a hobby, but now it's time to have a real job. So I kind of follow the safe path. So I did a business school in France, and then I went to the US in North Carolina. I went to Wake Forest University to do an MBA. And then I actually worked for 10 years as the sales and marketing director for Proctor and Gamble.
Why marketing? Why did you choose to go into marketing?
It's funny because I think that I didn't really know what I wanted to do back in the day. I started in finance. I interned in finance. I hated it. I actually quit an internship in finance, which was a pretty bad way to start in life. So I tried finance, then I tried sales, and marketing was, let's say, my favorite path amongst all of those. So that's why I did it, but I was not really excited about it. But I worked for this great company, Proctor and Gamble, during 10 years, selling very exciting products like laundry detergents and shampoos and razors. But I'm very grateful for this experience because I learned so many things, and some of the elements that probably make that I was able to build my business so quickly after that.
Well, what were some of the biggest lessons, some of the biggest things that you learned from being in marketing for Procter and Gamble that you still use today?
I think the biggest thing that have marked me is humility. When you work on markets that are so competitive, are the ones that we have with Procter and Gamble, like laundry detergent, shampoos, you're competing against like big companies like Unilever, L'Oreal. And if you are not humble, all of a sudden you can lose so much business. So I try to keep that in mind, my own business right now with everything that I do. Stay humble, respect everyone, because you never know who can bring you like amazing business and big business. And I think one of the pitfalls of this industry sometimes is that people forget that. So this is really something that has marked me.
Yeah. And the market, we all know the wedding and events industry is so saturated now, whether you're a photographer, a cake designer, whatever it is, planner, it is just so saturated. I think going into it with humility does allow us to be more creative in the sense that, look, there is competition out there. On one hand, there's a lot of business out there, but in order for us to get the kind of business we want, I agree to go into it with that humble kind of an attitude is going to just simply allow our minds to be more open, I think, creatively. Don't you think?
Exactly. So, humility, hard work are really some values that are important to me. It is absolutely a very saturated industry, but on the other hand, you don't need a lot of investment today to get into wedding photography or wedding planning. And that's one of the beautiful things. It's very easy to start as a company because you can work from home, you can work behind your computer. You just need to set up a website. It's not like you need like millions to start. So it is saturated, but on the other hand, there are like so many beautiful opportunities.
Well, and in a few minutes, I do want to learn more about how you grew so fast, because from what I understand, you haven't really been doing it that long professionally, and yet you've got great success. You're speaking at Engage in London soon. You're, at the time of this recording, it's in a few weeks. You've got 70,000 Instagram followers. I really want to get into all of that. But for a moment, to go back in terms of your transition from being a marketing executive, after 10 years and then deciding to go into photography, can you tell me about that? What is it that happened? What were you thinking to leave, as you said earlier, a safe job and going into this much more risky entrepreneurial kind of a position? What was going on in your head when, toward the end of your time at Proctor and Gamble?
So it was a very safe job, but I was in a miserable place, like personally. I mean, I didn't enjoy what I was doing. And I reached a point where I was almost depressed. I mean, on the paper, everything was perfect. I mean, I was having this great job, this great salary, but I felt miserable when I wake up every morning. So what happened is that a friend of mine asked me to shoot his wedding because he knew that I was a photographer for her hobby. And I shot that wedding and I was like, okay, that's fun. Shooting weddings is fun. But we cannot really make a living out of shooting weddings in France because the market is not where it should be. It's not the same as the US. So I will keep it as a hobby next to my day job. And that's what I did for 5 years. After 5 years, my eye-opener was that I went to a workshop, and the workshop was organized by Feather and Stone photographers. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're based out of California. And I will be forever grateful for these guys because they totally changed my perspective on the market. So I remember going to the workshop and introducing myself like, hey, I'm Greg. I am an amateur wedding photographer, and I will never go full time because there's no way to make a living out of wedding photography here in France.
Yeah.
Isn't that funny? And the answer that they had, I will forever remember that, was like, okay, you know what? Maybe you don't see these clients, but we fly to France 12 times per year and we charge more than $20,000 for these clients.
Wow.
And I was like, that's interesting. I kind of want that too. And 3 months after, I basically quit my job.
Well, but before we go there, you said that when you were taking this seminar, we'll call it photography out of California, that it changed your perspective. Is that the perspective that you felt that now this is possibly within reach? Is that what it was that changed for you?
Exactly. I was feeling like, I mean, every single photographer, wedding photographer in France back in the day, not a lot of them were like professional. Most of them were amateur photographer doing that next to a day job. And that was my vision of it too. So I was like, this is fun to do on the weekend, like 20 weekends a year. This is good pocket money. It allows me to reinvest in equipment. So why not? But there's no way I will ever go full time on that job. And these guys totally changed my perspective on that.
But I want to check. So you must have been around 30, 31, something like that in your early 30s?
34, 35.
Well, now, were you married at the time?
I was actually married. And I mean, it's not funny, but my personal life was kind of in the same place as my professional life because the year when I quit my job is the same year when I got divorced.
Wow.
So yeah, it was kind of a rough year, but to me, it just a symbol that I was not where I should be in my life. And that the reason why I kind of felt miserable when I woke up in the morning, something was wrong. I had followed the wrong path since the beginning. And all of a sudden, I felt the urge to change something. And I basically changed everything in a 3-month course.
Wow. Well, Greg, it's interesting. I can really resonate with this. And because I worked for IBM for 8 years and then Lexmark for 8 years. Yeah. I mean, and at the time, well, IBM is a big company, but at that time, IBM was like the Harvard of computer companies. And I sold for them. And like you, I learned a lot about various things. But, when I decided to leave, and that was around my mid 30s also, something like that, I had a 4-year-old daughter when I finally left, and I was married. I mean, in terms of financially, I was really scared, and so I hired a consultant, and I had a 2-year plan to save a certain amount of money and get for me, it's music business, get it to a certain level where I could leave the corporate world and pretty much make the same amount of money. Now, for you, were you financially okay that you could switch, or did you really take a leap off that cliff and just say, I'm going for it?
No, it's funny because I have exactly the same story, because my daughter back in the day when I switched was not even 4. She was like 2.5. So all of a sudden, I go from working for Proctor and Gamble and probably making like $10,000 a month or something like this, being the owner of an apartment in Paris, being married, having a daughter, to, okay, let's take that leap. Let's take that jump. And all of a sudden, I'm a divorced father with a kid and trying to live out of photography. So I didn't have a financial backup. But I think the good news about that is that from day one, I was like, you know what? I need to make that amount of money into photography, because otherwise, if I don't do it, I will just quit. So I think the fact of not having the backup also helped me to very quickly go to a high-end clientele with high prices because I didn't have a choice. I remember my first year professionally, I was like, okay, this is going to be my pricing. And every single wedding photographers in France told me, this is not going to work. You're too expensive. This is not the US market. You're going to fail. And my reply was like, maybe I'm going to fail, so I will be out of the business. But if I want to make it, I don't have a choice. This is what I'm going to have to charge.
But how did you skip it? It's interesting. I interviewed Lori Aarons, who has a similar story, not in terms of leaving a job.
We worked with Lori a couple of months ago together.
Oh, did you? Yeah. But Lori has a similar story in terms of right from the start, going for that high-end market. And she was able to pull it off. And that is so hard to do. As far as you're concerned, how did you do it? I mean, what was your portfolio? You said you had shot maybe one wedding, or maybe for 5 years you had shot some weddings. How do you present yourself so that the people in the luxury market understand the value of what you're doing, of what you're charging? How did you pull that off?
I think the key to that was to be really focused. I had shot weddings for 5 years next to my day job. This is not the portfolio that I wanted to show. The minute I went professional, I decided to focus on US clients getting married in Europe. I am based in Paris. I am European, and I think I'm European in the way I did things. I mean, which can be kind of different from being an American. So I was like, I see some amazing clients who fly a photographer from the US. I feel I can do a decent job. So I'm going to try to get these clients and make them save some money on flying someone from the States. I speak decent English because I've lived in the States. I kind of know the American culture, but I keep that European touch. So I think I have something to bring to the table. So from day one, I decided to focus on that clientele. So it means I was communicating only in the States. I was only posting on Instagram when the American clients were up, even though I am based in France. And all of a sudden, people started to see me almost as an American based in Paris, and I kind of like that. So I think what made a difference is to be very, very focused on a niche. I didn't mean to go and shoot weddings in the States, which kind of happens right now sometimes. But I was like, we have such an amazing market here in Europe. I mean, the south of France, Italy, Lake Como, the Amalfi Coast, you name it. And there are so many American clients doing destination weddings here. I want to have these clients.
Well, but Greg, how did you get these, again, we'll call them these luxury clients from America to be aware of you?
I think that branding as a whole made a difference. If there is something I can do is branding, because I did that for 10 years. And branding to me is different from communication. Communication is a part of branding. So for example, shooting film, which is something I have always done, was something important because I was one of the first photographers to shoot film in Europe. It was a differentiation. It helped me to stand out on the market. And as of a sudden, you show film images, and film images, there were a lot of them in the States, but not that many in Europe. You show these weddings in Europe on film. So as of a sudden, there is the attention of the American clientele. So film was an element of differentiation. Instagram was for sure, because as of a sudden, you have access to clients all over the place. And I've been on Instagram for probably, 6 or 7 years, if not more. So I was not at the very beginning, but kind of at the beginning of Instagram. And using the right hashtags, posting at the right moments, having your weddings published on Martha Stewart, on Style Me Pretty. I mean, everything was focused on putting my work in front of American clients.
That is so interesting to me. And you have built up to, you have approximately, as of today, 70,000 Instagram followers, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is really significant. I want to make sure that you're aware of 2 other shows that are on the Wedding Biz Network. First, The Business of Being Creative, hosted by founder and president of The Business of Being Creative, Sean Lowe. Sean's consulting firm is focused on providing practical advice to those in the business of being creative. Tune in every Tuesday to hear a new episode chock full of topics and advice for creative businesses. Also, check out the 2 seasons of Stop and Smell the Roses, hosted by the one and only lifestyle and event design expert, Preston Bailey. Preston speaks with such an honest voice. I know you're going to thoroughly enjoy hearing him on this unique platform. You can find both shows at theweddingbiznetwork.com or on your cell phone's podcast app for both The Business of Being Creative and Stop and Smell the Roses. In a moment, I want to come back to the social media and how you utilize it. But earlier, you also mentioned that you understand the American culture, but that you also have a European touch. And we'll get into film too in a moment. Can you put into words what you mean when you say that you have a European touch?
Simply the fact of shooting in European location is going to be part of it. It's always fun to me to realize that I live by the Eiffel Tower, and when I post a photo of a couple in front of the Eiffel Tower, I'm going to score so well on Instagram, even though personally I'm honestly so tired of shooting in front of the Eiffel Tower.
Right.
And on the other side, if I'm going to shoot couple in Yosemite or on the West Coast in California, I'm going to be so excited because this is different from what I used to see. This is something actually that also excites me a lot because I love like outdoors, big landscapes. But as of a sudden, I don't score as well as when I post in European locations.
Well, it's very romantic to us Americans. You know, it just is. It just is anything in Europe.
So romanticism is going to be a part of it. Maybe fashion is going to be another part of it. Being based in Paris, I have lots of fashion clients I work for. So, I mean, having worked so much in fashion the last couple of years, maybe I approach the bridal portraits with a fashion touch, and that's something clients are going to like. A word which is really important to me is differentiation. How can you differentiate yourself from everything else and bring something new to the table? And for a long time, being a European photographer working with American clients was definitely a part of it.
Mm. And you mentioned film, and your website says shooting medium format film. What does that mean, medium format?
So medium format is basically, let's say, the highest possible quality you can find right now. Medium format digital is going to be very expensive to shoot right now because we're talking about cameras that are worth like 30 grand, 40 grand. But the good news about film is that right now you have access to amazing medium format film cameras at a low price. So the quality is amazing. The depth of field is amazing. And still, they are very easy to shoot, and it doesn't require any time in terms of editing because your photo lab is going to do that for you. So this is one of the reasons why I love film.
Mm. And coming back to the social media for a moment, before you had mentioned using the right hashtags, publishing at the right moment. What advice would you give about finding out what the right hashtags are?
I definitely think it's so much more difficult today than it used to be, like, let's say 5 years ago, because if there is something which is saturated right now, it's Instagram. And I cannot wait for what's next.
Right. And there is going to be something next. There always is.
Of course, there's going to be something next.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, I invest a lot of money on my website because I've always considered my website as my home. And that's what's going to be left once Facebook is done, Instagram is done, etc. But I mean, Instagram is going to be a matter of consistency. Are you sure you always post with a great consistency? Are your 9 last images perfect and work well together? And in terms of hashtag, once again, I don't use them a lot anymore because what used to work 5 years ago doesn't really work again today. I mean, if you look at destination wedding photographer, hashtag destination wedding photographer, for example, there's going to be millions of photos behind it. But I must say that 5 years ago, this is something that worked very well.
I see. There were lower amount, and so it came up more in people's feeds.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, also, when you mentioned that you're doing fashion, and I understand, that clients, also love that kind of an approach. I know you're doing fashion jobs, you're doing editorials, you've got billboards, you've got photos on billboards. What percentage of your business is related to fashion and also editorials?
Over the past couple of years, I would say 20%. This year it has definitely been bigger because I had this big job for Balenciaga that was massive in terms of time and also financially. But I will say that it's 20%. So we're talking about fashion brands calling for campaigns. We're talking about fashion brands using me for backstage photos because here in Paris, we have fashion weeks every 6 weeks. So there are so many of them. So there's a lot of opportunities to work in fashion when you work in Paris. I've always seen me as a wedding photographer first because this is where I have my heart. But it's just interesting for me to see something different and to also be able to shoot in the low season here, because what we must admit is that in Europe, the wedding season is very, very concentrated between May and October. I do 80% of my wedding jobs on this time frame.
So you fill in the rest of the year with a lot of the fashion and editorial work.
Exactly.
And, in terms of clients being attracted to that kind of style, they are obviously more educated now, more than ever before. They're utilizing social media, and for various reasons, there's just much more information available. So it seems that expectations for clients have risen. How do you feel about that, their level of education and what their expectations are?
I totally agree. And it's definitely one of the reasons why I cannot wait about what's next after Instagram. We always have big fights with my fiancée because she's all about Instagram. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm so tired of it. And one of the reasons is, it's difficult right now to show up on a weddings and the bride has not compiled like 20 pages of like Pinterest boards and like Instagram photos that she has seen everywhere. So the clients are definitely much more educated. And the pitfall of that is that sometimes they just want you to reproduce the 20 best photos that they've seen on Instagram without considering the fact that a wedding is a live event. The weather might be difficult. The wind might be difficult. The timeline might be difficult. So they don't take that into consideration and they build these high expectations just because they have spent the last 6 months on Instagram compiling everything they like.
Then what is your process with a client? From the time you meet them and they bring these Pinterest boards and all of that, how do you work with a client from the very beginning? The
first thing I say is that I will take into consideration their board, but they have booked me for a reason, which is my style, and I will never try to reproduce a photo. So I will try to interpret what they mean by their board. So for example, if there's a lot of sunset photos, I know that they will want a lot of photos at the golden hour is there's a lot of details photos. I will say, okay, this client, what's really important for them are the details. But I never take the boards like per se, like, okay, I'm going to do like every single of these photos because this never works.
And so what do you do then? How do you communicate with them about that? And what is your next step?
Basically just managing expectations and mentioning again and again that they have booked me for my style. They should trust me with the fact that the wedding photos that I'm going to produce are going to be very much in line with what I deliver and the reason why they have booked me for. But it's all a question of managing expectations and mentioning that my job on the D-Day is not to be reproducing exactly the photos that they have compiled in their board.
You know, I really like that you're direct with them, that you say to them, you've hired me for my style. You know, I like, why not, right? Why not be direct with a client?
You know what? Every time, and maybe that's another thing that I have learned in my previous job, but every time I have not been direct with a client, even though I knew it was the right thing to do, there has been problems. And I know it's difficult at the beginning of your career because, I mean, you want every single job and you want to please your clients. But every time you leave some shadows on what you can do or cannot do, there's going to be a problem.
Also, you're dealing with people being very vulnerable, right? I mean, when they're, you know, having their photos taken, especially if if there's a bride involved, you know, so much of the focus is on them. And I'm wondering how you deal with, how you manage the just the vulnerability, the anxiety that a couple will get from that.
I learned through the years that the good answer to that is confidence. People want to feel that you're in charge and you know what you're doing. And I tend to feel that the reason why the bride is going to send you like boards and inspirations is because the wedding's going to be on a couple of hours. I mean, on 10 hours on a single day. And she has like prepared it for like so long that she wants to make sure it's going to be perfect. The moment when she realizes that you're in charge, you know what you're doing, you're calm, everything disappears. She's not talking about boards anymore.
Yeah.
And I always give that example that at the end of the wedding, when I say goodbye to the bride and groom on the dance floor, 99% of the case, they're going to be like, okay, Greg, thank you so much. We love your job. And I always make that very bad joke saying, okay, just wait to see the photos. But it's funny because you realize that the way you behave, the way you reassure them, it's almost like psychology during the day. At the end of the day, they are already 100% convinced of your services, even though they still have not seen one photo.
Right.
And when that's the case, 100% of them are going to tell you, oh my God, Greg, I love the photos. So I think confidence and experience, I mean, longevity on the market. I mean, I've been shooting weddings for 10 years. So I guess it helps also to be more confident with bride and groom than at the beginning. But once you bring that to the table, everything else disappears. And I think it's a good way to manage the bride and groom anxiety on the day.
That's such a great point. You know, if you were giving a masterclass to some, you know, photographers who want to get to the level that you are, what would you focus on? What would be some of your biggest, most important tips and advice?
I actually gave a masterclass yesterday afternoon in Paris, so this is very fresh in my mind.
Okay.
But the biggest thing I tell them is you need to get out of your comfort zone. And when we're talking about comfort zone, when we're talking about self-confidence, you realize that 90% of people who work in the wedding industry, their own limit is themselves. And we're talking about planner, we're talking about florists, we're talking about cake designers, we're talking about photographers. And I talk about that a lot when we talk about pricing. People are like, oh, I cannot charge it. And I mean, why not? Who knows? And it's funny because a couple of years ago, I had a photographer coming to me and say, Greg, I want to consult with you because we are on the same inquiries, but the clients book you for budgets that are going to be like $15,000, $20,000. and they book me when their budget is 5,000. How come? And I'm like, but do you even propose like $15,000 in your packages?
Right.
And he's like, no. And I'm like, why? Because I'm not worth it. Okay, so why would you complain that clients won't book you for $15,000 if it's not even part of your packages? So getting out of your comfort zone is going to be key. And it's funny, I think it's something that we all have. I mean, when I launched myself as a professional photographer, my first question was like, who am I to pretend that I'm a professional photographer? I don't have a degree. I was even like considering the fact of like getting a degree in photography just to get that stamp. And at one point I was like, no, I don't have to prove it to anyone. I'm just going to grab it. I have clients. So that means people like what I do. So why not?
And, in terms of giving advice to a bridal couple on how to choose a great photographer, like how would you, I think what a couple would like to know is what are the differences between being a good versus a great photographer so that they can make that decision?
I always say there's two elements we need to consider. The first one is style. Of course, they need to love the photos and they need to love the aesthetic. And the second one is the personality. And what they need to check is the full gallery of a photographer. Because the world we live in, people post photos on Instagram, but they're going to show you the best photo or the two best photos of a wedding. And the client wants to make sure that the work of the photographer is consistent through the day. So from shooting the details to shooting the venue, to the portraits, to the ceremony, to the dancing party with a flash. So they will need to check a full gallery of the photographer, but the first two elements are styles and personality. Because I mean, I'm going to spend more time with the bride during the wedding day than she spends with the groom. So
That's right. That's right. That's true. That's really important. And I know, we mentioned earlier, you're going to be speaking very soon in a few weeks at Engage. What is the topic that you're going to be talking about?
Actually, it's not finalized yet, but I really want to talk about what I call the authentic branding. Once again, branding is really important to me because I think that building a brand is what's going to make a difference on the long term between someone who stands out in the industry, whether he's a planner, a photographer, or florist. The brand is going to make a whole difference, but people usually, I realize, they don't realize all of the elements we have behind a brand. A brand is going to be the product you offer, the service you offer. It's going to be your network. It's going to be your communication. It's going to be your ethics. It's going to be the values you offer your company. It's going to be so many different things. And people tend to think that branding and marketing is basically just communication. And I think it's so much more. And the reason why I added authentic is because, once again, humility and authenticity is something that is so important to me because I think it's crucial to build a company on the long term. And I think because of Instagram, we have so many people right now who pretend to live a life which is not their real life.
That's right.
And I think that's a problem because it's going to be misleading for the clients and you can get lost here. So I want to focus on that topic that I kind of call the authentic branding.
Well, and obviously this applies to anybody, not just photography. So I think you've chosen a wonderful topic. I think that's going to be really interesting.
Absolutely. I want to address all of wedding vendors because I just realized once again that this is a big need on the market and people need some keys in terms of marketing and in terms of business.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. We could all use that. And as far as the photographers who are listening, I understand that you also give workshops.
I do. I give one workshop a year. It's been 2 years that I've called it the home workshop because I do it at home. So in my studio, which is also the place where I live in Paris. So that's where I host my workshop and I have 20 attendees every year. So usually it's in the spring and I'm currently designing the next one. So it's going to be in the spring of 2020. And I'm currently designing the dates and the style shoot and the partners who are going to be with me on it. So the announcement is going to be made pretty soon.
Okay, and we'll include in the show notes, all the information about the workshops. I understand you also sell gift cards through your website. Is that right?
I have a print shop where I sell my prints because thanks to wedding photography, I've traveled so much. And I just love also shooting landscapes and travel photos. So I do have a print shop on which you can buy the prints, or you can just decide to offer gift cards.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, we'll also include that. And just a last question for photographers listening. What is your favorite equipment that you are currently using?
So my favorite equipment is definitely my main camera, which is the Contax 645, coupled with the 80mm lens, colorized lens. This is my film camera. This is the camera and the lens I shoot 90% of my work with. My second favorite will be my iPhone. I'm not a big equipment guy. I mean, if you see me on a wedding, I just have one camera in my hand. I cannot work with a strap with 3 cameras around me. I'm going to sweat too much.
Right.
So I just keep it simple. And if I need to zoom in or out, I just move. I get closer to my subjects or further away. I try to keep it really simple.
Well, wonderful. Greg, I really appreciate the time that you've taken. I'm very interested to maybe talk to you again about branding. Specifically that's something that, again, all of us are always struggling to understand even better. So I'm so glad that you're going to be speaking on that at Engage. And again, thank you so much for being on the show. This has been really wonderful.
Thank you, Andy. This has been really exciting.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Greg Finck. Be sure to check out his website, which is gregfinck.com. That's Greg, Finck.com. On social media, you can find him at Greg Finck. And if you could think of 3 good friends who you think would really enjoy listening to this interview, please forward it to them. Next week's guest is going to be a brand new interview with Julie Novak, CEO of Party Slate. And finally, if you could follow us on Instagram, in particular at The Wedding Biz. And I want to mention too, I really love hearing from you, my listeners. So feel free to DM me, direct message me on Instagram at The Wedding Biz, and I'll definitely get back to you. And I'll catch you next week.